Today we will actually start now.
Holy Spirits.
Well, I forgot my Bible. Hold on a minute, let's get.
It feels weird only having 4 people. More they were cashew stuff. Cashews, right? No. Sorry.
While you guys were snacking, I was seeking the Lord. I just want
You know what, Derek? You can seek the Lord anytime, but you just flip that
Yeah.
switch. Flip that switch.
Still can.
It's mindset.
Well done.
Good stuff. I'm glad you've been paying attention. I want to read to you Isaiah.
Since it starts eating.
This is completely unrelated to our lecture, but I believe it's our word from God, so we're going to read it anyway. I'm reading Isaiah 55, verse 10 onwards. As the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return to it without watering the earth and making it bud and flourish, so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out of my mouth.
Amen.
It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. I just want us to pause, think about, we're studying the Old Testament. This is the water from heaven that waters the earth for us. The Word of God it's powerful, and it always achieves something. Every time we gather and sit under the Word, God is sending His Word to bring life to us, to do something in us. It's never inactive and dull and static. So every time we come, we want to receive whatever God is doing. Today's lecture is on Leviticus and Numbers, which is seriously hard work for most people, and like, how on earth is it relevant to the 21st century? But it's the Word of God, and it's going to give us food and drink, which is going to produce fruit and a harvest. So we just want to keep that in our minds while we're studying. Also, the other reason I was just thinking about, the other reason we need to get this is when we read the New Testament, this is Paul's mindset, this is his worldview when he's writing. The people that wrote the New Testament, they were coming out of here, so they're assuming that we know this. They're assuming that we're familiar with all this stuff because they just refer to it all the time. Okay, here we go. Let's have a look. Leviticus, the third book of the Torah. What is the Torah? First what? Okay, the Torah is the written law. The Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible, that's right. 5. Pentagram, Pentagon, 5. Pretty much the same. This is the third book. It's the Hebrew title is Anti-Call because it's in Exodus. And God called to Moses and said, and God called to Moses. And now we're just continuing on the same story. Really, there's not supposed to be an end. God just called Moses again, and so that's the whole point. From Exodus 19 all the way through Leviticus to Numbers, halfway through Numbers, is all really the same. It's one complete story. So that's why we do them in order and want to get the flow of what's happening. Leviticus means, that's a Greek name for it, relating to the Levites. Who are the Levites? They're the tribe that were chosen to be the priests. That's right. How did they get to be the priests?
Because they're the ones that didn't worship the golden idol.
That's right. They're the ones that didn't worship the golden calf.
Yeah.
Very good. So they were always chosen to be the priests. Okay. Let's go in our timeline. Sean, can you do me a favour?
Yes, Lord.
Do you want to click on the PowerPoint? How does that do that? It must come out.
Is this one touch screen? No.
No. But if you can click on the PowerPoint, then I can click it from here again. Our timeline, we are...
Which mouse is it? This one?
the not Mac mouse here. So now that one. No, you'll have to look at that screen and click somewhere in PowerPoint. Anywhere, ready? Just click.
That's it.
There?
Yeah.
Yeah, but mine's not working. Got it. Okay, I'm good. Okay, so here we are.
Derek, if I take the mouse over there, does it reach here?
Maybe not. This should work. Okay. Maybe I help it all. So we've got the Sinai covenant. This is where we are in our timeline. Exodus has happened. We haven't quite got to the wilderness phase. Last week we talked about Exodus, deliverance, and then discipleship. This is their discipleship program. So they've come out as slaves, a rebel out of Egypt, and now God's transforming them into His awesome nation of people. And this is how He did it, basically, through Leviticus and Numbers.
Is that what we call the Sinai covenant?
Yes, where's Sinai Covenant? That's where we're at. That's right, we're at Sinai Covenant. This is all the 10 Commandments were given on Mount Sinai, and this is more detail about what it means to be God's people, to live under that covenant. One way of analysing the structure is starts off talking about offerings, then it talks about the Aaronic priesthood. What's Aaronic priesthood? What would that mean?
From Aaron?
That's right.
Yeah.
Aaron and his kids were all the priests. He scored because he was Moses' brother, really. That's pretty good, isn't it? So he became the priesthood. There's a big section on what's clean and unclean. We'll talk about that because it can be confusing. There's a Day of Atonement. That's really important. That's the feast. One of the feasts, very important feast that they talks all about. Then it's got the Holiness Code, which is 10 chapters of be holy because I'm holy. Again and again, God says, I'm holy, I'm the Lord, I'm holy, you should be as well. So, God wanting them to reflect Him. Right, we'll start off. Okay, what sort of writing is it? They call it ritual writing. Now, we're not used to that at all. That's where it describes lots of, we get a lot of detail on the process of what you should do. On the first day of the month, the priest will do this. On the second day, he will do that. Then he'll do this, and the sheep will do this, and you people will do this, and you'll wave your hands. And we're like, that's describing a big ritual. They were into that sort of thing, but we don't really know what to do with that sort of writing. We're like, boring. But the whole point is, they were acting out the message. The ritual that they performed is the message. It is the teaching. So really the main thing picturing what was going on and that was how they learned. Because they're in a illiterate society, okay, they didn't stand up, they didn't have Bibles to read, or they couldn't read books on what God was like. If you want to know what God is like, well, when you were a little kid, you remember that you would always go to the tabernacle and your father would do this, and your mum would do this, and the priest would do this, and that's your understanding of what God is about. It all comes from what you see and all of these things. So it's quite important to get a handle on what's going on and stuff. So the understanding comes from what were they seeing and doing, and what impression were they getting. Like one of their rituals was you'd get a goat and you'd bring it to the temple, and the priest would put his hand on the goat, and then they'd send the goat up into the wilderness. And they're like, what is that? And the idea was when he laid his hand on the goat, all the sins of all the people went into the goat. And then the goat was sent away. And so therefore all their sin was gone as well. They all got that all our sins on the goat, and then the goat gets led away and never to be seen again. So that's God's taking our sin away from us.
That reminds me of when the demons go, can you put us in the sea?
Yes, similar sort of thing. Yes. So they had an understanding of that when, they would do a sacrifice, and in the tabernacle there's all the smoke from the incense. That's all coming like this. And then you do a sacrifice, and the smoke of your sacrifice would go up and mix in with the smoke of the incense. And as far as the people are concerned, they've laid hands on the animal, blah, blah, blah. That's like their worship is into the Prince of God is the incense. And then, well, now our sacrifices mingled in the presence of God, so we're right there with Him. That was all, it all meant stuff. Now, do we do this sort of ritualistic stuff? Do we have rituals that are supposed to communicate our message? Yeah, now, yes. You can still believe it's 21st century. So, can anyone think of rituals that 21st century Christians do?
Oh,
Raising your hands. Why would you do that? What does it mean?
it means like,
It's a sign of surrender, maybe, sometimes.
A pose of praise.
That's a praise. Yeah. Reaching up to heaven. God's up there and I'm connecting with Jesus, right? I'm touching Him somehow.
Definitely.
Communion. Classic. What is the point of communion?
Wash your sins.
It's the blood of Jesus, the body of Jesus, the cross of Calvary. Every time we do church, right?
Yeah.
Right in our faces, He hung on the cross, He bled, He washed away our sin, give us all that stuff is carried out. You can preach forever on communion. Everything you need to know about the New Testament, like in the communion story.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important. Anything else?
Tithing?
We pray.
Tithing, praying, yeah, sort of, but there's not much form and action involved with those, is there? Like
Oh,
baptism,
Yeah, baptism.
classic, baptism, death and resurrection. That's why we're fanatics on full immersion baptism. We don't get with the I'll throw water at you thing, because it doesn't imply the death and resurrection of Christ, my death, my resurrection, new life. You don't get that from getting a little bit wet. But everyone sees it, and everyone understands that when buried, come alive. The New Testament, that's very strong. That's what baptism is about. So we do it a little bit. They just did it a lot. Most of everything, that's how they got their stuff. We do it. Even in our society's moved away from it a lot. Weddings, right? There's ceremonies and rituals associated with weddings. The exchanging of rings. There's nothing in the ring, but it means something. It used to mean something. Now the meaning's a bit vague, and who knows what it means. Throw in the flower. They all mean something. And
I do.
the different, some of it's legal, but most of it is ceremonial. Why are you wearing a white dress? Why are you wearing a veil? All that stuff is just a ritual thing. Most of the meaning is lost because Western society is really bad at holding on to meanings because we abandon doing what we do the same way as before. I want to look different, all about me. And so we lose all of that. 21st birthdays, I don't know if people still do it, used to give the kid a key, right? The big key. Why did you give them a key on the 21st birthday?
Freedom.
In theory, they were now a mature adult responsible for the house, just like you. They have, theoretically, they get their key to the house. They can come and go in their life. They're as responsible as all the other adults. These days, half the time, by 21, they've already got their own key. They've been out living where they like, doing what they like for so long. So we've lost the meaning.
It's mainly filling in America.
Yes, so it depends. See, because as our society's changed, 18 is the big number now, rather than 21 and things like that. But we haven't really come up with 18-year-old keys. We've just abandoned the whole thing because there's not been in former generations there were definite ages and cut-offs when people graduated through stages of life. But we've sort of abandoned. We're so individualistic that we've lost all that, and we've lost a lot of that, the meaning. And so therefore, people on life is meaningless because we've zapped on the meaning. It's one of the problems.
Anniversaries, when they used to say, so many years is a golden
anniversary, all those mean something. No one has a clue what it all means now. You get on the internet and figure it out and say, why am I doing all this, Tradition and some tradition is bad and we can get rid of it because it means nothing, but we're really good at throwing away traditions that actually are valuable as well. So they have rituals to keep hold so no one would ever forget. Every year they'll do the Passover feast to remind themselves of the Passover story so they'll never forget about Egypt, never forget about God. And they're supposed to tell your kids, this is why we do this. This is why we have this land, and because God brought us out of Egypt and great and mighty hand, and they would build into their lives rituals that meant they would never forget. Very important. It's interesting, it's one of God's ways of teaching people stuff, as through the whole ritual process. When God wants to teach people stuff, He does something, and people see Him participate in something, and then we remember a lot more than just by learning. That's even why I get you all to write the image on the whiteboard, just so you hopefully will remember something out of the past, because you actually did something. So historically, the ritual side of it's very important. There's some narrative, there's some storyline in it, but not much. Because most of it is, and God said, and Moses said, and God said, and Moses said, and there's huge amounts of it. There's a bit of law, some things that are right and wrong, it's all a bit mixed together. It's about a 1 month time period. Okay, so God's come into the temple, and He's in the temple, His presence is there, and now He's speaking, and people are being changed and transformed from hearing the word. And it continues for about a month until they get ready to go into the promised land. So that's pretty much the timeline. The offerings. There's a few offerings. They were really into offerings. We've got a burnt offering, a cereal offering, which is sometimes a grain offering. Peace offering, sin offering, guilt offering. What were they all about? They all had slightly different functions and meanings. They sort of get mixed together. As you read each one, he'll say, you do this because, and you do this because, and this is sort of explained in all the texts. The burnt offering, basically, to get an animal, when you kill it, you burn it. Complete dedication to God is the main point. Okay, nothing left over, everything is committed to God. Do you remember when they invaded Jericho? What went wrong when they invaded Jericho? Does anyone remember the Jericho story? They invaded Jericho, they won. The next battle they lost because...
And they didn't do the way that God said?
Because God said everything that's there must be burned up and destroyed.
Yeah.
Don't take for yourself anything. Everything is devoted to God. Committed to destruction. And then one of the guys took some gold and stuff and kept it for himself. Yeah. And therefore destruction came upon the army. Because that thing was devoted to God, committed to destruction. And so if you take it, then you're devoted to God and committed to destruction. Because the curse follows it type there. And so the burnt offering was one of the demonstrations, fully devoted, no compromise, no half-hearted, fully devoted, burned up. We sing the song, all consuming fire consume me. It comes from burnt offerings. That's where we get that language, because it's been completely consumed by the fire. Often the burnt offering, you would burn some of it, and especially the peace offering, which is sometimes called fellowship offering. You'd have an animal, you'd burn some, this is all God's, but then you'd eat the rest. And it would be a big feast party. So whenever you'd have a fellowship offering, it's mainly fellowship with me and God are mates. We welcome God to the table, He's sharing our meal with us, He gets a bit, we get the rest, and we have great fellowship together. All of our fellowship, feasting time surrounds around the relationship with God and things like that. A grain offering, you would burn it as well, if it doesn't burn as well. So you might cook it and bake something and then eat it again and wave it in the sky, all sorts of different things they do with it. One of the big points about the burnt offerings, the sin offerings and guilt offerings, they were normally sheep, hogs, goats or bulls or whatever at different times. The shedding, we get from them, the shedding of blood is essential for forgiveness of sin. That's the thing that runs through the New Testament. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. That's why there have to be sacrifices. If someone's sinned, then someone's got to pay. Jesus' blood, of course, that's why we say Jesus fulfills the Old Testament stuff. These paved the way that there's a price to pay for sin, and you could die, or a sheep could take your place. That's the basic principle, and it's reinforced through the different offerings, and of course Jesus comes and takes over that by taking the place fully. But that's quite important. You can't just let sin go by, and that someone has to take the consequences of it, and it could be a sheep or it could be you.
Or the person. Sheep or a bird.
It could be you, yeah. If you sin, you can die yourself, or you could take a sheep, but no one is ever going to volunteer themselves. So God didn't want them to volunteer themselves. He provided a way where He used a sheep instead. Laying on of hands is another one that we do. A guilt offering and a sin offering. There's ones for there'll be some offerings. If you know you've done something wrong, you've got to bring. If you've done this sort of thing wrong, you bring this offering. If you've done this sort of thing wrong, done this offering. If you've done this, you bring this offering. Different, depending on how bad you're being, depending on how expensive your offering is. And then there were offerings for all the things that you've done wrong, you haven't even thought about. You haven't even realised that you've done wrong. You've got to cover them as well. And then the priest would have to have some for him, and he'd offer some for all the people, just because he knows they're all sinners. Before he goes to the temple and worships God, a better offering for all the people because they're all bad. And then one for me as well, for all the things I know about, and one for the things I don't even know about, and then we can go to see God. That was the general deal. Really stressing that sin and God don't get on. Very, very significant through the whole of this. Seriously, God is holy. We need to have our sin removed so that we can be with God. We can't just go and visit God and turn up whenever we like, because sin is a problem. Now there's this unclean and clean thing. We'll go through clean and unclean. They had like a spectrum, like a zone, where at one end is the holy presence of God, and at the other end is the unclean. And average every day is in the middle. So there was, we could, for example, take this clicker. This is just a clicker. We bought it from Office Works. If we decided that this was only ever to be used in the house of the Lord, only to be used for the proclamation of the word of God, it would become holy. But then we could buy the same clicker and we say, I'm going to use that for doing PowerPoints about medical illnesses. Or, okay, I'm doing PowerPoints about recipe cooking. Okay, this is just a clean explanation. If I was to do it about an unclean subject, then it will become an unclean thing. Okay, because it's now associated with something that's unclean. Now, what was unclean and what was clean? Does anyone know? What were the unclean things in the Old Testament? It's not really the same as sin. Leprosy was unclean. Any discharge from the body was unclean.
Your left hand
The left hand was not unclean. It was a little bit weaker than the right hand, but so weeping sores, oozing things, your menstrual cycle, that was unclean, that was pretty bad.
Were pimples unclean?
Pimples would have been considered unclean, yes. What else? Dead bodies, unclean.
So
Anything to do with death is
If you did
unclean.
have pimples, you are holy then?
If you what?
So if you did have pimples, you are
If
unclean?
you had no pimples, because if you've got a blemish, you're not allowed in the presence of God. An imperfection, you can't go in the presence of God.
But we're made all in the image of God.
Yes, but if your body's blemished, I'm sorry, if you had certain injuries, you weren't allowed in the presence of God. You weren't allowed to go to temple because you were considered
then
unclean.
what's that saying about God then?
That's right. That's what we need to understand. What is it saying about God? What is the whole point? For they had it like if you had leprosy, you're unclean. If you were having your period, you weren't allowed to go to the temple. If you had certain injuries, you weren't allowed to go to the temple just because you were considered substandard, not perfect.
So you know the lady that was
Yes.
had the blood issue,
Yeah.
and she went out.
Went to Jesus, yes.
W-
She was breaking all the rules. She was unclean.
So at that time, was that who you were thinking?
She knew she was unclean.
Oh,
And said that's a really powerful story because she was unclean. Now, if you touch an unclean person, you become unclean.
wow. Yeah.
So if a priest is walking down the road and he happens to trip over, oh my God, I just tripped over a dead rabbit. Now, he's now unclean, he can't go to the temple. Okay, Samson, remember Samson found a dead lion and his honey, well that was unclean, you're not allowed to touch. Corpses, unclean, anything dead's unclean. So that lady was fully unclean.
But Samson, God,
Well, you were still unclean, and you were supposed to be sincere. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm unclean. Okay, so I've got to stay away. How do I deal with being unclean? Well, normally you wash yourself and you wait a couple of days outside and then you come back. That was the general process, and there was probably some hygiene elements to it, but some things probably not as well.
like what if you had like birthmarks or something?
Yes, problem. Like if you were bringing a sheep to the altar, it has to be perfect. If it's got any scratches or cuts or oozing eyes or any diseases, can't bring it. It has to be perfect.
So if
Same with people.
If I had a birthmark on the side of my face since I was born, I'd never be allowed to
Yes.
the temple.
Problem for you, you're out of the temple.
But I'm made in God's image.
Yes,
So
but too
God-
bad, because it's like a perfection scale. It's an unusual thing, and everything lived on that scale, and we totally don't get it.
So-
And it's totally not fair.
Did God come to use the scale, or did they just decide?
It's Leviticus tells it. It's all through Leviticus. Unclean and clean. Now, the point of the lady with the blood who's bleeding, right? She's not allowed to be with all those people. Everyone she's touched is theoretically unclean. Her main point was to touch Jesus. What happens when she touched Jesus? Jesus should have got unclean.
Yeah.
But this is the whole thing about Jesus. One of the things that story tells us is Jesus is so much better than this old system. Because an unclean person touched him and she became clean.
Wow.
So the power of Jesus, as he came and he overrode the whole unclean thing, his cleanliness and his goodness, is so much more powerful than the Old Testament system because he makes the unclean clean. So he changed, instead of the unclean making you bad, he now makes the bad good. So that's one of the big things about the Jesus gospel, which was controversial and different to the Jewish thing.
Was it also because of her faith?
It was her faith, but ritually, according to the system,
Yeah.
she wasn't even allowed to be amongst all those other people. And she broke all those rules about her hunger to find Jesus. And when he touched her, any other priest would have gone, if they found out, he made her come and tell everyone. So she had to come up and tell everyone, I'm sorry, but I'm unclean. And I've been walking through the crowd and I touched the priest, and I'm unclean.
Yeah.
And he said, good on you, your faith has healed you.
Wow.
So he turned the whole thing around and said, yeah, you all think I should be horrified and I should leave the temple and be bad. But no, my power has made her clean.
But every time,
And so it's a total turnaround.
every time he touched like a leper or something.
Every time he touched a leper, he was breaking the law. That's right. You're not allowed to touch lepers. The Bible always says, the leper says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And the Bible says, Jesus reached out and touched him first, and then he said, be clean, and he was healed. So Jesus totally defeated, overrode this whole unclean thing by the way he touched lepers, the way he dealt with the woman who had the clean thing. Very powerful, very confronting for the Jews.
But the coming of Jesus did rewrite a lot of Jewish.
Yes, that's right. That's the whole point. So the whole clean, unclean thing is obviously superseded by the coming of Jesus because of the way he demonstrated. He touched the lepers. He touched the woman. The power went from him, overrode that. Whereas there was more of a...
I think before he died.
Yeah, before he died. That's right. That's right. Yeah, so it's very powerful. It was all about really what was appropriate. One of the concepts was, like, one of the rules in Leviticus is when you're in an army that has a camp, you must make your toilets outside of the camp. Because God is in your camp, and that would not be okay for him to walk around and see your toilet. Okay? Because the toilet's not clean, and he's holy, and it's... Yeah, so it's like an appropriateness to be near God, yes.
And it's just hygiene.
Leviticus told them. So certain animals were clean and unclean. So you weren't allowed to eat the unclean things just because God said they were unclean.
Thank God.
So Leviticus says, there's a list in Leviticus. Anything with certain sorts of feet, well, that's an unclean animal, don't eat it. But these ones you can, and these ones you can't. Like the shellfish thing, they're on the unclean list. Certain birds were okay, and certain birds weren't. Owls were unclean. Various types of birds and animals were clean and unclean, and you weren't allowed to, just they weren't allowed to.
Were ravens clean?
I can't remember, don't know, but good question.
Because
they came and fed Elijah, that's right.
Well, Noah used
them and stuff like that. I don't know, but yeah. So there's a big differentiation, and sometimes you think maybe it's to do with hygiene, and sometimes you think maybe it's to do with. Sometimes it's definitely the other nations do this. That's not okay for you. So differentiating them from the other people, so that you're God's people, you're different. They might do it, but we don't. There was some of that going on, and there was some of probably hygiene things and stuff, and some will really have no idea. But it was a very strong in their mindsets. Every day you wanted to be clean and not unclean. And if you were unclean, that would interrupt your whole routine of your day because there's things you couldn't do. You couldn't, like, theoretically, you should avoid coming home until dark because otherwise you'll make everyone else unclean, and then it's just complicated. Hard work, really.
If you think about it, right, it'd be just like within today's society, if you've got a cold, right, or a
Quarantine,
flu,
yes.
really, then it makes you unclean, as in if you went to work, you pass it on.
Yes,
So
that's right.
it
It was considered like that.
Yeah,
So the lepers were outside because they were unclean, and so the hygiene aspect of it is one thing that sometimes seems to fit, but not always.
Yeah.
So all sorts, but the idea God's here, so everything around has to be like really perfect. There's things that are considered not perfect, so let's keep them away. You're not stuck there forever. There were ways to get healed of leprosy. If you thought you're getting healed, you had to go to the priest and get do tests and things and stuff. Okay, so it's all holiness is a big deal. We've said holiness is a big deal in Leviticus. You're going to be God's people. You're going to be awesomely holy, set apart for God all the time. It's mentioned 85 times. God is here, so you must be holy. And the sacrifices and stuff, I know you're not going to be holy, so all these sacrifices will help you stay connected and in covenant with me, even though you keep not making it. Yes. So there's a lot of the how-to of the sacrifices and what the priest is supposed to do. There wasn't much about where to go to worship. The Exodus covered the tabernacle, but then this is all what they're supposed to do with the tabernacle. Now, I've already talked about this.
So what happens if a Levite becomes unclean?
If I leave, well then they couldn't be a Levite for a while. They had to leave the camp, go away, do their ceremonial washing, wait 3 days or 2 days or 1 day, whatever it was, and then when they're finished, they can come back. And so, but the Pharisees would have been the ones that knew us and were experts at following this whole thing and avoiding the unclean things. So that's why, one of the reasons why they say that the Good Samaritan story. You're walking down the road, you see a dead person who might be dead. He's lying on the ground, he's been beaten up by a rob. He might be dead. The priest can't go over there because he'll get unclean. If the guy's dead, then the priest will get unclean, the Levite will get unclean. So they're avoiding it because they don't want to get unclean. Okay, and that's like your deontological rule keeping. I'm going to keep myself clean, so I'm going to avoid being nice to someone. He might be alive, but just in case he's dead, I don't want to be unclean, so I'm going to go to temple, so I'll stay away. Whereas the Samaritan didn't care about being clean or unclean, it wasn't his problem. He just went over and helped the person. So that's one of the things that's going on in that story. Yeah, really cool. The only other thing, this is Peter when he gets his vision, eat all these animals, he was seeing the shopping list from Leviticus that said don't eat any of these things. And he's like, of course I'll never do that.
Yeah.
And the Holy Spirit saying, you misunderstanding what clean and unclean is all about. And actually talking about people. But yes, so that's where in the New Testament we see this clean and unclean thing. In the book of Hebrews, very strong, and Aaron used to be the priest, but Jesus is not a descendant of Aaron. He's not a Levite. He comes from the tribe of Judah instead. Yeah, and David was descended from Judah. So he's from Judah. So there's a whole, one of the things in Hebrews is, this is your priest, and these are the rules that go with that priest. The priest is a mediator of a covenant. Here's the covenant, here's the priest, and here's the rules. Now Jesus comes, the new priest, the new covenant, new rules. That's basically how the New Testament looks at Leviticus and all those sorts of rules and stuff. Now, do we remember the 3 types of laws? We talked about last week, 3 types of laws.
And
Ceremonial, what do you think?
Ceremonial,
Civil and moral. Oh, yes, right. So most of Leviticus is ceremonial. How to do the worship, how to do the thing, all that stuff is ceremonial. There's a little bit of civil laws as well, but mainly ceremonial. Okay. That is pretty much Leviticus. We've also got to do Numbers. And Deuteronomy. Oh my goodness, come on, let's roll. Numbers is a lot more exciting because there's stories in it. Yeah, Numbers. This is the 4th book. The Hebrew title is In the Wilderness. The Hebrew books normally named them after the first words of the book. But they called it Numbers in the Greek and English translations because there's so many senses and counting in it. And the point is, we're about to invade the Promised Land. Let's count how many people are in our army. That's basically what's going on.
Is that why it's called Numbers?
That's why it's called Numbers, because it's full of numbers. Now we've got a transition on our timeline right now. We're moving away from ceremonial, ending Sinai Covenant, and unfortunately we're heading wilderness. Because Numbers is the book with most of the people that got it wrong, and so they had to go around the wilderness. Numbers is where they got to the edge of the Promised Land. They didn't go in, so they went back in the wilderness for 40 years. That's Numbers. So there's a lot of lessons. We see a lot of lessons in it because we don't want to do what they did. So here's our structure of the book of Numbers. They start off at Sinai, finishing off Leviticus with more commands and stuff. Then they go from Sinai, they walk to Edom, which is the border of the Promised Land, ready to go in. And then they start wandering around because they failed that. And then at the end, in the last half, they're moving on, going back, getting poised to go and having another go. So there's basically 3 sections. The first journey is let's go to the Promised Land. Oops, we didn't get that right. Wander around in the wilderness. And then the second journey, we're trying again, getting back.
Must have been so boring.
Incredibly boring. Seriously, must have been incredibly boring. Okay.
yeah, no.
So at Sinai, we start off with the tabernacle, and then all the people are camped around the tabernacle, and there's instructions on how you're supposed to camp, who goes where. So they're in things that's a bit like battalions in an army. So the first battalion says they're all not laid out like a war camp with the house of God in the middle. And this is where they would follow the cloud. When the cloud got up and moved along, then everyone would get up, follow the cloud, pack up the tabernacle, put it in all in carts, walk around, walk the cloud, stop again, set up the tabernacle again. That probably took a week to set up the tabernacle. And then everyone set up their tents again, camp, and they might be there one day in the move, or it might be 2 weeks, who knows. But that's what they did. And they did census where they count how many people are in the army. So they do a census, they count everyone. Then after the wilderness, we'll get to that, but yeah, then after the wilderness experience, they have to count everyone again. Of course. The Nazarite vow, does anyone know what a Nazarite vow is? You got that.
Is that the cutting of the hair?
Yeah, we're still there. That's right. A Nazarite wasn't allowed to cut their hair, they weren't allowed to drink wine, and they weren't allowed to go near a dead body. That's interesting. Because they were set apart, holy to God for their whole life. Rather than being your average person, who came to the temple once a year to sacrifice, but then lived their own life the rest of the time. They were set apart for God their whole life, special person, a bit like a Levite who's not a Levite, and so they weren't allowed to cut their hair.
Was Samson
Samson.
Nazarite?
Yes, Samson was a Nazarite. He was told to be a Nazarite from birth, set apart for God, so don't cut your hair. So the problem with cutting your hair was not magical, strong muscles in your hair, it was disobedience to the covenant of God. Because you're a Nazarite, you're allowed to do that. And because you disobeyed, you lost your power. That was the whole
But
point.
he did eat from a dead corpse.
I know, see, that was wrong as well. He shouldn't have done that either, because he was a Nazarite. He wasn't allowed to do that.
God, like, closed.
God was patient, yes, but he was, those are all the story telling me how bad he was as a Nazarite. He was a complete fail as a Nazarite. Because he broke all of the rules.
So Nazarites are like super strange.
Well, only Samson. But they were super set apart for God. They were the zealous believers, you know.
So if I was a Nazarite, I would have like super strength.
Only Samson had super strong strength. The rest of them were just zealous for God.
Uh-huh.
The other important thing is the Passover. The Passover feast, they celebrated the Passover feast, they get told how to do it, and all stuff like that. The recurring theme in the first half of the book, they do this, the Lord said. So the Lord said, I want you to celebrate the Passover, I want you to eat this food and have this feast, and da da da. And all the people did this, the Lord said. The Lord said, I want you to da 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 da, camp out your people and do this thing. And all the people did as the Lord said. Recurs again and again, they were very obedient. Then we go on a walk. You can't see it. You can't see. They follow the red line. They go up from the bottom of the desert, up the top. They go up to go to the promised land at the top of the loop, and then they come back down again because they failed.
Wait, so what's that loop? Is that loop?
That's them going up, getting ready to invade the promised land,
Oh.
and then they turn around and come back down again after they disobeyed and wouldn't go in.
Why didn't they just have this thing like that?
Oh, just because they had to follow the cloud.
Wow.
Oh, wait. Oh.
Wow.
So, and then you'll see at the end they cross over the river and they go up the other side, and that's where they finally invade from second time round.
On that side.
Up on the right hand side of the river. That's where they wander around, all around. They go all the way up to the top, and that's where they actually do their invasion. So very exciting. A lot of walking. They would have been nice and athletic people, but as you say,
sandals never wore out, did they?
their sandals never wore out.
Food.
Some good
And
stuff.
is that when God was fighting with manna coming?
Manna from heaven every day. That's right. This is the manna time.
Oh, cool.
So every day there's manna coming out of heaven. They didn't have to. They had to get just enough and not too much. You weren't on Friday night. Friday you got 2 loads of manna because there's none coming on the Sabbath. And if you went out on the Sabbath,
Did you
there's
say on
none there.
Friday night?
And
Sabbath
now
was
you can
Saturday.
understand, if they disobeyed and kept walking themselves and it went bad.
It went bad the next day. That's right. If you keep some for tomorrow, that went bad. You only get enough for today.
Yeah.
A lot of inches, a lot of principles and numbers.
So they weren't very were they coaching people then?
Ah!
Well, they had just the right amount.
Yeah, because
But they always complained because they didn't like it. They got sick of it.
They went bad. So like, would you like kind of like stuff yourself like, I'm bored now?
Sarah, what do you think? Well, they did. They all got sick of it.
Yeah.
They all got sick of it. They wanted to go back, be slaves, and eat
It's
other
like
food.
sort of like black bread.
It was
Well, like
seedy
red
stuff.
thin, like.
Yeah. There was a seedy stuff that they had to grind and mix and cook and.
Yeah, but didn't they end up getting quails or something?
Yes, after they whinged, they got quails coming, and then they got food poisoning from the quails, and half them died. And God had good prognosis, had to pray for them to be healed, because like God said, oh, these grumpy, okay, I'll give them what they want, but then they got sick.
When's?
Wow.
I don't think how many.
It's full of numbers. If you add the people up, a lot of people say 3 million.
Wow.
Some people say that's ridiculous. There's no way 3 million people could have ever been logistically controlled without any form of electronic communication. That would have just been chaos and probably unsustainable and blah blah blah. And so they say different numbers, but it all depends on how you read the sense of the numbers in the book.
But when you have God,
That's right. And for people that say 3 million, God's mighty, he can do anything. And other people say, seriously, how much room would have been taken up, and the logistics of it would have been impossible. We must be reading the numbers wrong.
You know, when you hear stories like this, that's like as if that would happen. But now, if you look about refugees, they've been walking miles
Yes.
to get out of.
That's right.
You know.
Thousands and thousands of
Yeah,
refugees
yeah,
going through, yes.
slavery.
So the main things they did, Numbers. Let's go to Numbers 11. Just have a quick taste of what they did. Who's got Numbers 11? Yeah. Who's going to get there first?
Now the people complained about their hardship in the hearing of the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused.
That's it.
Then fire, you want me to keep reading?
What happened? Yeah, go.
Then fire from the Lord burnt among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. When the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down.
That's very good.
So that place was called Taberah.
Taberah was fire forward. And the next one, verse 4, the rabble began to crave other food,
Yeah.
and they all started wailing,
Mhm.
and that's when the quails came. We hate this manna. Moses was cross, the Lord was angry.
Moses was always cross.
He had a hard time. So food came in and then they all got sick. They craved other food a few times. Miriam and Aaron started complaining. Chapter 12, this is at 20.
Sorry.
Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife. That's an Egyptian wife, not a Jew, a Hebrew lady. That's a bit naughty. But he married a Cushite. Has the Lord only spoken through Moses, they said? Hasn't he also spoken through us?
Mhm.
And the Lord heard this, and this was the problem. Because God heard them complaining against Moses, and so Miriam, Moses' sister, gets leprosy. Zapped with leprosy because she's been so disrespectful. And Moses prays for her, and God heals her and stuff, but it's a bit rough. And then, of course, the great problem is when the spies come back from the promised land and say it's too hard. And all the people rebel and they don't enter the promised land. So there's a big slide from doing well in the first half of the book to doing bad by chapter 14. And this is how they end up dying. In the wilderness, they complain, they grumble against leaders, and they refuse to obey God. So we have this nice little wee set here. Now this is quite interesting. Okay, this one. Yes? Oh, that. Okay. We've got Miriam sings a song of praise at the start, and this is the first chapters. They complain about the water, and God heals it and makes it okay. This is in Exodus. There's manna and quail in Exodus 16. God provides. There's water from a rock in Exodus 17. The leaders are appointed to help Moses because of his hard work, and they attack the nation of Amalek, and they're victorious. Things are going really good here. The Lord and then we have Leviticus where we all get the law and we all be educated in how to be people of God. And we have a very similar parallel thing where instead of Miriam praising, she's complaining. They complain, and instead of getting help from God, God kills them with fire. They have manna and quail like they had in Exodus, but this time it makes them sick. Water comes out from the rock again, but God is cross because Moses hit the rock, and so Moses gets judged for it. Some more leaders are appointed, just the same as in Exodus. And they attack the same people and they get defeated. That's after they said no to going to the promised land. They said let's go, and they attack, get defeated. The point of the whole thing is that there's a much higher, appears to be a much higher expectation on the people after they've received the law than before. Beforehand they were new converts, didn't know much about God, and he was very gracious, but after teaching and instruction and training, God expected more from them, and when he didn't get it, they got less and in more trouble. Reminds me very much of one of the things that Pastor Ross says. Once God's proved himself at something, we don't have a right to come again for the same thing. We're supposed to grow and learn and not repeat our same mistakes that we did before. And God expects after teaching us something, he holds us accountable for what's happening.
Yeah.
Sure.
Is it at Mount Sinai where Moses hits the rock and he was meant to do that? Or is,
Where was the rock? No, it's a different rock.
or is
It's a
that the
different
one
one.
where milk?
It's a different mountain.
Yeah.
I can't remember which one, but it's a different one. I think pretty sure it's a different one.
So why did he get in trouble for hitting the rock?
Because God told him to speak to the rock, not to hit it.
Oh.
Now this is interesting. God told him to speak to the rock to bring out water, not hit it. Right? Now Paul says that the rock was actually Jesus. The rock that followed them around was Jesus. That was a symbolic representation of Jesus. Jesus was the cloud and he was the rock. Now when Moses hit the rock, that's paralleling
He hit
the Pharisees crucifying Jesus. And that's why Moses was out. If he'd spoken to the rock in full life, it would have been okay, but because he hit the rock, He was in the way prophesying that the Jewish leaders were going to kill the rock, Jesus, and that's why, I reckon that's why he encountered judgment. Because he struck the rock, and he wasn't supposed to strike Jesus, he was striking at Jesus. Very interesting. Yeah, amazing. The parallels between the people in the wilderness is so strong with that Jesus and stuff. There's so much of that in there, that is very, very enlightening. Okay, we keep moving on. Numbers. We go to Jordan. There's a bronze snake story, which Jesus talks about. They complain, snakes come in, and then God tells Moses to make a snake and put it on a pole, and when everyone looks at the snake, they're healed. And Jesus talked about that and said, as I'll be lifted up like the snake was lifted up. And then, near the end, no one dies.
But would that snake be symbolic because of the devil? Or?
I would say the snake is symbolic of sin. The sin was put on Jesus. Jesus was lifted up, and the sin was on him. And you see, yeah, I would say so. Yeah. And then we start getting ready to enter the promised land. Okay, the main things that the New Testament tells us about this. This is just a brief summary in Jude. Although you know this, I want to remind you, the Lord delivered his people out of Egypt, but later destroyed those who did not believe. That's Numbers. But you must keep yourself in God's love. Don't repeat the mistakes, or what happened to them might happen to you. Hebrews 3. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion during the testing in the desert. Same thing. Don't do what they did in Numbers. Let us make every effort to enter the rest, so no one will fall by disobedience. Faith and obedience are totally inseparable in that section, in that story. If you're believing, you're obeying. If you're not believing, you're not obeying. Now let's quickly do a them, us, and me story. Do you want to do chapter 20 or chapter 21? Let's do one by each. So Sarah and Sean, Numbers chapter 20, verse 1 to 13. And Chris and Angela, discussion time. Numbers chapter 21, 4 to 8. So you've got 2 minutes to read the passage and do it to come up with a them, us, and me presentation for class. Your passage is Numbers 20, 1 to 13. So you two, together, can do a collaborative effort. And your Numbers 21, 4 to 8. And let's do 2 minutes worth. So be quick. You've got a long story to read, so you have to apply that.
Numbers
21 to 13. Okay. Discussion. Come up with 1 point each on them, us, and me. How about that?
Discussions.
Then, what would be the people there, right there at the top, what would they have got out of that story? What would it be for them? Yeah, them first.
Water. They got well, it was Moses and Aaron. So neither Moses nor Aaron got to the promised
So just press that one.
Yeah.
And then, is that good?
Yeah, it's cool.
Cool.
It's more about
Okay, oh.
Moses
Oh,
narrating
the
the story
battery's
than necessarily
going.
the Israelites.
But I just replaced the battery.
Battery's running out.
Yeah, looks like it's
Yes. Almost time.
So they must have
We've got 20 minutes.
It's okay, I've got another battery.
Okay.
Derek,
Yes.
in this one,
Yeah.
when it says,
Let's stop.
I'm stuck on
Okay, so the first story is the snake in the wilderness. Is that right? And let's have the interpretation.
They went against God, they spoke badly about God,
Yep.
and so God punished them by, and so God punished them by sending a snake and started killing people. So it brought them to the realization that they were sinning, doing the wrong thing, so they tried to find Moses and repented.
Yep.
And so asked God to stop it, and He's given them a way that they can
Yes.
be forgiven and not die.
Very good. So complaining and talking bad about God and Moses was a mistake, and God made a way for them to be rescued from the consequences of their sin. Awesome. Great. Yeah. Us, interpretation?
Just like today, when we do wrong, we can confess, and Jesus died on the cross and He forgives us, so that we're forgiven.
So you're saying there's a parallel.
Yeah.
We sin today and God makes a way.
Yeah.
Yes, that's very good. If we repent, yes. And it's because that passage is a special passage, that because Jesus referred to that story, whenever we're thinking about that, we should look at that. And Jesus said, in the same way the snake was lifted up, I must be lifted up. So that is telling us about the crucifixion. It's telling about Jesus. It's telling us, even then he was pointing to that story as a story to find out about what Jesus done. Because Jesus said, that's me. I'll be lifted up just like the snake. Talking about the crucifixion in particular, and being that everyone who looks to, the idea was if you look at the snake, you get healed, right? So for us, we have to look to Jesus.
Yeah.
That's the looking that was the healing thing. So have got to have our eyes on the one who's been influenced of that. Okay. Personal interpretation. Anyone have a personal interpretation of that? Me? We need to look to Jesus. That's right. That's very good. Okay, let's go to this side over here. We've got the story about the water coming out of the rock. Them.
This is complicated.
Keep it simple and short.
Alright,
Just
so
one aspect.
for them, when Israelites cried out, God heard their prayers, and then He went to Moses, and God told Moses, go speak to the rock, and water will flow. But then Moses went to the rock, and he hit the rock, and twice, and because he hit the rock, he actually disobeyed God, and because of this, he wasn't allowed on the promised land.
Yeah.
So for them, what's this kind of stuff in this?
Them.
Because it's like it's mainly talking about Moses, but
Yes.
it's also got the Israelites.
Yes. So I would say
God still allowed them to have water, obviously.
he gave them water. So with that they had
But
no water.
it's because Moses wasn't holy in the spirit. In
Moses
front of,
wasn't obedient.
Yeah, he wasn't. What did it say? Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land. So for them, yeah, they need the Moses needs to trust God.
Yes. 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 And I would say, primarily for them, that would have been a significant warning for them. Even Moses, if he disobeys, he runs into trouble. Even Moses is not so far, like, he's the great holy leader, everyone honors Moses, but if Moses stops believing and starts disobeying, he won't enter the promised land. Now, if I was one of the people like, whoa, we better do what we're told, otherwise we won't enter the promised land either. Even Moses gets it. Let's make sure we dot our I's and cross our T's, because God provided water for the people, but Moses is going to miss out because he didn't do what God said, as God said it. And there's always a link between trust and obeying. Because he doesn't say, because you didn't obey me, he says, because you didn't trust me.
But even Aaron's not, because Aaron needs to be up on the pillar.
Aaron was already gone, that's right. Because he had,
Yeah, beforehand.
yeah. Okay, ask interpretation. New Testament believers.
We could learn the same story, like learn the same lesson others, I guess.
Obedience, you're saying? Obedience is important for us too.
Because we want, if we don't obey God, we want to
Obedience is important. Now, we run into trouble like, if we stop obeying, what do we lose? What do we have to obey? We sort of have to be careful, and people have differing ideas about how far do you take the obedience and blessing thing. If disobedience means you're out of the promised land, well then it depends on what your definition of the promised land is as to what happens if you disobey. And that's a different people have different ideas on that. The other really important thing about this passage as well is the New Testament refers to the story. So whenever we're looking at an Old Testament passage, if it's referred to in the New Testament, we want to take our main thing from that. And if Jesus is the rock and he supplies abundant water, we could probably say that there's something about the Holy Spirit here, because Jesus is the one that provides living water for us. And the Bible says Jesus is the rock and he provided the water. So we want to read the New Testament passage about the Old Testament passage to guide us in what's the big main point. And the New Testament passage said that Jesus was with them and he was the rock that followed them around and gave them water and all that sort of thing. So Jesus is the rock that gives water. In the New Testament, he's a well of living water, same sort of thing. So I would look to that as our interpretation. Jesus is one, but we get the living water from Jesus. Well, it's tricky, isn't it? Because it's a prophecy that they got the living water from Jesus after he hit the rock, after he struck Jesus. And that's about the crucifixion as well. We're supposed to call it out and ask for it, but don't hit Jesus to get water. What does it mean? Don't be the Pharisees crucified Jesus. I think that's what it's showing. And living water came as a result of the crucifixion. That's true, but we don't want to. Yeah, we don't want to crucify him all over again. Is what you do if you return to your sin.
Yeah.
So we see that as well. All of that stuff we can see in the New Testament telling us about it. But we want to speak and command the living water to flow. That's what we should be doing. Calling on Jesus. Okay, we're going to race through Deuteronomy. I took time to do that because that's the main point of this whole class, is that you can do them, us, and me. If we get through the class and we haven't done that, we haven't done what we need to do. So now we're going to go through Deuteronomy in 15 minutes. Here we go. Deuteronomy, these are the words. It's all about, remember we talked about the big king making a treaty with a little king? The suzerain and vassal thing. We talked about that. The big king makes a treaty with the little king because I'll look after you. Well, Deuteronomy is written like one of those treaties. Okay, the name Deuteronomy means the second law, which is a problem because it's actually the same law, but it's a copy of the law. What happens in Deuteronomy is they've got to the end of the promised land. Moses stands up and says, you're about to enter the promised land. Now remember everything that God has told you. And he basically repeats most of Exodus and Numbers so that they don't forget the law. But it's like ancient Near Eastern suzerain treaty, and we'll see that in a minute. Okay, here we go. This is covenant reaffirmed. This is what this means. We've got, on our timeline, we've been through the wilderness, all the people that came through the Red Sea, and that saw the Passover and the golden, and all that stuff, they will die. So none of the people here except Moses and Joshua and Caleb came through the Red Sea and saw the miracles of God in Egypt. So now he's got to tell them all again. Remember what happened. Remember what you never saw it, but your parents did, and he's got to tell them all the whole thing again. Remember the covenant. Remember the manna. Remember all the things God has done. Remember to keep the laws. This is why it's called covenant reaffirmed. It's a big repeat of the whole thing for the second generation. Okay. There's several ways to do the structure. One of the ways is it's like 3 sermons of Moses. He talks about the past stories, he tells them the law again, and then he tells them what's happening coming up, how to take it to the promised land and things like that. So it's like his big speech before the battle. He's the big general saying, giving them the prep up before the battle. And at the end, the last couple of chapters, Aaron dies and Moses dies and that sort of thing. There's definitely an urgency about his thing. It's very much a spoken book, because it's a speech. It's very much a spoken book with an urgency. Today, right now, straight away, important. Keep hearing, keep listening. Today, if you hear his voice, remember. Very urgency, because it's like we're about to go into a new phase. The future section has the very important chapter with all the blessings and curses, which is quite well known, and we'll look at that briefly. But that's looking ahead to the future. If you do this, God will bless you with all these blessings. How did that click by itself? Okay, so we've just done that. We're here. This is the treaty idea. And one of the ancient treaties, it would start off by saying, I am the king of Egypt, for example. I am the great king of Egypt over all of the lands that I rule, blah, 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 blah. I have just conquered this new land, and my armies have been so victorious, blah, 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 blah. And now I'll make you an offer that if you will become one of my colonies, I will build my roads and protect you with my armies. And as long as you pay me taxes and send me your best children to go to my universities and provide soldiers for my army and food for my palace, you do all these things and I'll do all this. And that was the way it would work. And if you don't do it, this is what will happen. I'll come with my armies and I'll kill all your children and I'll destroy all your palaces and speak like this is what's going to happen.
Is that why when the castles sort of like and the little walls in villages would start? Is that
They started, yes, very soon after you had villages, you had to have some sort of wall because the people would come over and just steal stuff.
yeah?
So they built a wall around their village for self-protection, yes.
For that.
Well, in general, it could have just been the neighbours. The village over there with 50 people in it, the village over there with 50 people in it. We could work hard or we could steal. Let's steal. Let's go over to that village and steal. So, very early on. But, yes, the reason you had fortified cities was to prevent kings coming along and doing this. But they would have a very similar structure. They'd start off with saying who I am and who you are. And so in the start of Deuteronomy it says, I am God, and here is Moses, and you are the people that I brought out of the promised land. And we get the story about, not I conquered you, but I rescued you out of Egypt, I performed great wonders, I've done awesome things. Now, because I've rescued you, now this is the relationship that we're setting up. You will do all these things for me, and I will do all these things for you. That's the covenant deal. Very similar paragraph setting than one of these treaties would have had. And then there's the whole blessings and curses. If you follow the rules, then these are all the blessings you'll have, and if you don't, this is what will go wrong. And then at the end there's even a witness section, where it says, because he says, I call heaven and earth as witnesses, and I call the land as a witness, all these different things, like a legal covenant document. And then at the end it says, at the end, it's got a last section about passing over. When Moses dies, who's responsible for enforcing this treaty? So handing over to Joshua, handing over to the generations that come. So there's a structure. You could say that this whole book is written to replicate one of those treaties between the great king and the little king. It's very similar. One of the points of that is God has picked something that they understand, and He's used their common communication method to tell them what they need to know. And it'd be like God coming to us and speaking to us with a Facebook post. Because we understand Facebook posts, but we don't understand ritual paragraphs. But if we get a Facebook post from Jesus, we get it. Okay? Because we understand how they work. So these days, we would expect God to speak to us through a Facebook post and not through an ancient treaty, because we don't understand treaties. God picking something that they understand as the way to talk to them. That's one of the points of that whole thing. The structure, and a bit more detail. Can someone please click the computer for?
Yep.
Click the mouse. Just click the mouse and see what happens.
Nope.
Yep, that's it. We have it's like a reflection. Another way of looking at it is a reflection of 10 commandments. Chapter 12, it looks at Commandment 1, Commandment 2, and more detail, Commandment 3 and 4 in the next chapters. So it goes through the commandments. The first commandments are about God, so it talks about honour me, worship me, blah, blah, blah. And then how to treat other people. In the second half, the laws about looking after people, relating to the 10 commandments about stealing and adultery and all that sort of stuff. So there's sort of a parallel between the 10 commandments and the book of Deuteronomy. That's another way see some sort of sense in the way it's all laid out. The main points of the book. Love is a big deal. This is a passage that has love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. That's a Deuteronomy quote. The ancient Near Eastern treaties would say that the conquered country must love the king that conquered them. Now when they said that, they didn't mean romance. You didn't even have to like them. But your love was expressed through loyalty. Your love looked like paying taxes, sending soldiers, and enforcing his rules. That was your love for him. So love was really an allegiance word rather than an affection word. And this is, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart. It's a covenant of primarily of allegiance. Yes. So that's one of the big deals in Deuteronomy. The other one is, I have called you and you are my special people. Just like Exodus 19, you are my treasured possession. Reinforced strongly, I am God and you are my people. Said several times. Again, reflecting we're the big country. You can imagine the king of Egypt conquers all these countries, and then he finds a little place that's got really nice waterfalls and really nice bushes, and he thinks, I'm going to use that as my holiday retreat. So he comes to that country and says, well, I really like this place. You're going to be my special favourite country, and every time I want a holiday, I'm going to come here. So therefore you get extra roads, and you get extra special, everything's going to be nice because the king's going to come. So it just gets extra special treatment. And that's sort of like what he's saying, you're going to be my special people. You're my favourite. Of all the countries that I've conquered, you're my favourite. Love must look like obedience. That's the next big theme. Very much all the time, observe the commands of the Lord and walk in his ways and fear the Lord and serve him. Every chapter he keeps saying, today, if you hear his voice, be obedient. Today, fulfill the laws, keep laws. Very strong in Deuteronomy, as we saw it also in Numbers. Here's this great passage quoted by Jesus, and the most famous passage probably that all the good Jews memorize. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Now, it doesn't really mean singular. It means complete and whole and full. So it's not like saying the Lord your God is one, not the only one, or there is only one of them, but God is completely unified and completely complete, completely whole, that sort of thing. And you should love the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And there's commands I'll give you today should be on your hearts. You should write them on your doorways and blah, blah, blah. A very famous passage, which we will probably do a them us on me on in about 1 minute's time. The other important thing in this Deuteronomy, the land is a big deal. The land is given to you by God, the great conquering king. The land is cared for by God. The land is not like the land of Egypt, it says, but where you had to irrigate the ground and do all this thing. Now this land is like the garden of the Lord, cared for by the Lord himself. It's so much better than Egypt. It's also a place of testing. And if you've passed the test, you get to stay in the land. And if you don't pass the test, you don't get to stay in the land. Living in the land is conditional on the covenant, and that's emphasised strongly in Deuteronomy. You must keep the covenant so that you can stay in the land. And the other thing is you will get the land not through your own strength, but through the divine warrior's power. God will be the one that wins the battle. Those would be the big things that you can't escape from as you're reading through Deuteronomy. It's an important book for this reason as well. It's the transition between the first half of the Bible and the rest. So we have this little diagram here. We've got before the promised land, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers, they're all before the promised land. Deuteronomy is like the doorway, and everything after that is in the promised land. So it's a big deal for understanding what's happening in the thought of the people in the Old Testament. Up until that point, you were wanderers in the wilderness, in the desert, in Egypt, or whatever, and now you've got your own land, they've got your own home. There's a big change. Now, is it an unfinished story, is the question here. It is an unfinished story because when it ends, they aren't in the promised land yet. Moses dies, and we haven't really heard anything from Joshua yet, and they're still on the wrong side of the Jordan River, not in the promised land. You're not where you're supposed to be. It's looking ahead. It's looking ahead to what is to come, the promises that are to come. Promise of a home is a big deal about you will have a home. New Testament. Let's go to the New Testament. Are you keeping up? This is really fast. We're good? connection to the New Testament, quoted in nearly every New Testament book. Deuteronomy was the book they all memorized, and it's quoted as Genesis, Psalms, and Isaiah, and Deuteronomy are the ones that are used all the time. Especially Jesus, when he quotes, when he's being tempted, when he quotes about anything, it's normally a Deuteronomy passage. He quotes Deuteronomy when he says, talks about when the Pharisees about this law and that law, he's quoting primarily out of Deuteronomy all the time.
You clean from your bowl.
That's right, all that stuff, the laws, laws about unclean things, that sort of thing. Primarily, he's looking at Deuteronomy. That was really a foundation book for how they all lived and how they understood everything. I want us to do one them, us, and me passage, and I'm really not sure which one to do. Do you want to do Deuteronomy 6 or Deuteronomy 21?
Deuteronomy 6.
Deuteronomy 6 it is. Good choice.
It's the easier one.
It totally is the easy one.
Okay, read it.
You've read it already?
We did this last weekend.
Oh, how do you know?
Okay. I do want to quickly say, Deuteronomy 28, you will be blessed in the city, and we must do this because this is a great, what some consider a great fundamental error, so we're not going to be doing Deuteronomy 28. You'll be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. Have you heard that? Like, you'll be a kneading trough and your bowl will be blessed, and you'll be the head and not the tail. You will give to many and borrow from none, and all that stuff. And then it says, if you don't obey God, you'll be cursed in the city and cursed in the country, and your womb will be cursed, and your crops will be cursed, and that big passage. Now, we really like to quote the first half for us, Deuteronomy 28. I want all the blessings, blah, blah, blah. But I want to ask the question, does it really apply to New Testament Christians? The chapter says, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all the commands I give you today, which is what? If Moses says, follow the Lord and obey all the commands I'm giving you today, what's he talking about? He's talking about the whole book of Deuteronomy.
Oh, wow.
So if you do everything I've said today in my sermon, in the book of Deuteronomy, if you do everything I say, then this is how God will bless you.
So
Now,
it doesn't apply.
Therefore, it would say that we're not living in that land anyway. So if the curse is, if you disobey me, I will throw you out of the land. Well, we don't even live there. So therefore, we come to an idea, well, maybe this doesn't apply to us.
Maybe it means we're not going to heaven.
Maybe it does. See, that's one interpretation is the promised land is heaven, and if you obey God, you go to heaven, and if you don't obey, you don't. Now that's one interpretation.
Oh, that's not true.
Why is that?
Because doesn't it say that if you confess Jesus with your heart and with your mouth, you have eternal life in heaven?
Yes, so we've got to work out what is going on, don't we? What is it? Like in one place in John, they say, what is the command of God? And he said the command of God is to believe. So if the command of God is to believe in Jesus, then you've obeyed the command of God by believing in Jesus, so you're good.
When I get to heaven, I'm asking God for a textbook.
You won't need one by then. Okay, so after looking at that, the first response is, well, we want the blessings because they sound good. The second response is, oh, okay, we've got to keep all the laws of Deuteronomy to get the blessings. Well, we've got a problem with that. Anyone got anything else to add to the conversation?
Is this for them or us?
For us,
For
because
us.
yeah, we know what it meant for them. It was very clear, very literal. But for Christians today, do these blessings? Do we qualify for these blessings? Can we quote this over ourselves? The Lord, you will lend to many nations and borrow from none. The Lord will make you the head and not the tail. You will always be at the top and never at the bottom. Can we claim these promises for us?
Yeah.
How? But we haven't kept all the commandments.
Well, we're living in a different time because Jesus has already come and taken them away.
So, but do these promises apply to that back time back then, or do they apply to us today?
Well, what's Jesus say about it?
I don't believe Jesus commented on this passage. I've got one comment to say, because the only thing I've got to say is one passage says, every promise God has made is what? Every promise God has made is yes and amen through Christ Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. Every promise God has made is yes and amen through Christ Jesus. Therefore, I think the key is that Jesus has fulfilled the law. So we could say, if I was arguing in a court, Jesus obeyed all of Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
Okay, because Jesus obeyed Deuteronomy, Jesus gets all those blessings.
Yeah,
Now, as long as I'm in Jesus,
yeah,
as long as I'm hidden with Christ, connected to Christ, as long as I'm in Him and He's in me, well, whatever blessing He gets, I get.
yeah.
Okay, so the only way I can get those blessings is if I'm connected to Christ.
Right.
If He gets the blessing, then I get the blessing.
Yeah,
And if He doesn't get it, well, I don't get it. And in fact, the only way we get anything is if Jesus gets it.
yeah.
Because God blesses Jesus, and because we're connected to Him, we just get the trickle down effect.
Yeah. No.
So that would be Deuteronomy, and that's a good way to get those blessings. But we still have to think about, well, what happens if we step outside of Jesus? Do we start walking into the curses? Yes. It's a double-barreled passage. If you want the blessing, theoretically, I would say everything still goes. So the question becomes, how do you step out of Jesus? And how do you get into Jesus? But we will talk about that another time.
Who's up for lunch?
Who's up for lunch? We've got to have lunch. Thank you, Jesus.
Alright, what's Dora got to say first?
Done? Oh, cool. No, nothing. Go for lunch. Yay.